Did you know that hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, could be the key to our sustainable future? Imagine an energy source so clean, it only leaves water as a byproduct. Welcome to the world of green hydrogen, a sustainable alternative that could revolutionize how we power our lives. In the heart of Canada, a groundbreaking project is taking shape. Montreal-based renewable energy firm TS Canada H2 Inc. is gearing up to construct a multi-billion-dollar green hydrogen project in Quebec. The environmental benefits? Staggering. It's projected to reduce 3% of the province's carbon emissions by the end of this decade, all while creating hundreds of jobs and unlocking a cleaner, greener future. This is not just another project, but a green revelation, a pivot towards sustainability, and a testament to human ingenuity. Now let's dive deeper into this revolutionary green energy project in Canada. In the heart of Quebec, a firm named TS Canada H2 Inc. has embarked on a journey to harness the power of hydrogen. This isn't just any ordinary endeavor. It's an ambitious $4 billion green hydrogen project that could change the face of renewable energy as we know it. The vision behind this project is as grand as its scale. It's about more than just energy production. It's about a commitment to a sustainable future, a pledge to combat climate change, and a promise to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. TS Canada H2 Inc. is not just building a hydrogen project. They are constructing a beacon of hope for a cleaner, greener world. At the core of this project lies innovative use of wind and solar farms. These renewable energy sources will generate the majority of power for the project, ensuring that the process of hydrogen production is as clean and green as possible. Picture a landscape dotted with wind turbines, their blades slicing through the air, turning the power of the wind into electricity. Imagine a solar park, its panels gleaming under the sun, soaking up the sunlight and converting it into energy. This is the vision that drives the project, a vision of renewable energy in action. The project's scale is awe-inspiring. With an estimated energy block of 150 megawatts, it's a testament to the potential of renewable energy. It's about harnessing the power of nature, about turning the wind and the sun into a source of clean, green energy. But the project is about more than just energy. It's about job creation, about fostering economic growth. With 200 permanent jobs set to be created and over 1,000 temporary jobs during the construction phase, the project is set to have a significant impact on the local economy. This project is not just about energy production. It's about creating a sustainable future. It's about reducing carbon emissions and combating climate change. It's about showing the world that a cleaner, greener future is not just possible, but achievable. And it all begins here in the heart of Quebec, with a project that has the potential to change the world. This isn't just a dream, it's a reality in the making. Today as we speak, the blueprints for this green revolution are being turned into tangible structures. The project, a $4 billion initiative, is on its way to create a sustainable energy future for Canada. At the heart of this endeavor are 100 wind turbines and a solar park, all being meticulously constructed. These aren't your everyday wind turbines. They're technological marvels, designed to harness every gust of wind to its maximum potential. And the solar park? It's a vast expanse of cutting-edge solar panels, absorbing the sun's energy to fuel the green hydrogen production. This renewable energy duo is projected to generate an impressive energy block of 150 megawatts. That's enough to power tens of thousands of homes. But it's not homes we're powering here. It's an entire green hydrogen project. The energy harnessed will be used to produce 70,000 tons of green hydrogen annually, starting from 2028. The project is not just about creating a sustainable energy source. It's about creating opportunities. Currently, it's providing over 1,000 temporary jobs during its construction phase. And once it's up and running, it's expected to create 200 permanent jobs. It's shaping up to be a beacon of hope for the local community, providing both employment and a cleaner environment. Even though we're talking about the future, the progress so far is palpable. It's not just about the physical constructs. It's about the momentum this project has gathered. It's about the excitement this project has stirred, not just in Canada, but around the world. It's about the belief in a cleaner, greener future that this project has instilled. The wheels are in motion, and the future is looking greener than ever. This isn't just a project. It's a testament to human ingenuity and our unwavering commitment to a sustainable future. And while 2028 may seem a long way off, every day brings us one step closer to this green dream becoming a reality. But what does the future hold for this ambitious project? As we journey into the not-so-distant future, we encounter a landscape reshaped by the transformative power of green energy. The TS Canada H2 Inc.'s Green Hydrogen Project in Quebec, a $4 billion endeavor, is not merely a construction blueprint but a vision for a sustainable future. The project's ambitions stretch beyond the simple production of renewable energy. It aims to create a ripple effect in the local economy, promising 200 permanent jobs to the people of Quebec. It's not just about generating power, but also empowering the community. And the impact of this project on the environment? Nothing short of profound. By 2030, it's expected to reduce the province's carbon emissions by 3%. That might not sound like a huge number, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a substantial stride in the right direction. But let's delve a bit deeper into the heart of this project, the production of green hydrogen. From 2028 onwards, the project is set to produce a staggering 70,000 tons of green hydrogen annually. This isn't just about harnessing the power of wind and sun anymore. It's about transforming these natural resources into a sustainable, clean, and powerful alternative to traditional fuels. 1/3 of this green hydrogen will be utilized to decarbonize long-haul transportation, a sector notorious for its hefty carbon footprint. The rest will be used to produce electric renewable natural gas, another step towards a greener future. In essence, this project is a testament to the potential of human innovation and determination. It's a testament to our ability to envision a future where energy production doesn't compromise our planet, but contributes to its preservation. The project promises a future where energy does not compromise our planet. This isn't just about powering homes, it's about transforming industries. The impact of this project is much broader than the energy sector alone. It's about a sustainable alternative to the heavy industries, such as cement, aluminum, and steel. The very backbones of our infrastructural development that have, for decades, relied on fossil fuels for their operations. Now, they have an eco-friendly option on the horizon, thanks to the Green Hydrogen Project. Imagine the massive cement factories, the aluminum smelters, and the steel mills all running on green hydrogen. It's not just about reducing their carbon footprint, it's about transforming these industries into leaders of the green revolution. The potential is enormous, and the implications are profound. But the impact doesn't stop there. Let's talk about transportation. Long-haul transportation has long been a significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. With 1/3 of the green hydrogen produced from this project destined for decarbonizing this sector, we're looking at a future where our goods are transported across vast distances without adding a ton of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. Think about the trucks, the freight trains, and the cargo ships, all powered by green hydrogen. It's a future where the hum of engines doesn't equate to the choking of our planet. This green hydrogen project is not just a step towards clean energy, it's a leap towards a sustainable future. This is more than just an environmental initiative, it's an industrial revolution. And this revolution, unlike the ones before it, is not shrouded in smog and soot, it's not black or gray. The industrial revolution of the 21st century is green. As we approach the end, let's reflect on what we've discovered. Montreal-based renewable energy firm TS Canada H2 Inc. is pioneering a green revolution in Quebec with its $4 billion green hydrogen project. Utilizing the power of wind and solar, the project aims to produce 70,000 tons of green hydrogen annually from 2028. This isn't just a win for renewable energy, but also for the economy and job market. 200 permanent jobs will be created, with over 1,000 temporary positions during construction. 1/3 of the produced hydrogen will decarbonize long-haul transportation, with the rest being used to generate electric renewable natural gas. And the impact doesn't stop at Quebec's borders. This project is a step towards Canada's ambitious goal to slash its greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. The significance of this project is monumental, not only for Canada, but for the world. It showcases the potential of green hydrogen as a sustainable alternative for heavy industries. This is just the beginning of a greener future. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on our journey towards sustainability.